Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The big global story we are tracking this evening. US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke over the phone earlier this week and discussed bilateral ties. The discussion between the leaders was aimed at easing tensions ahead of Taiwan's upcoming presidential inauguration. This is the first direct communication between President Biden and Xi Jinping since their meeting in November last year. Meanwhile, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen kicked off her 5-day visit to China. Speaking at an American Chamber of Commerce event, Yellen flagged the country's industrial overcapacity, citing that there are growing concerns over the global economic fallout. She highlighted that China is too large to export its way to rapid growth and would benefit by reducing excess industrial capacity, which is pressurizing other economies. She also lauded China for its market reforms, calling it one of the most significant economic success stories of our lifetimes. Joining us now to take this forward is Sean Rain, founder and MD of China Market Research Group, and Brahma Chalani, strategic affairs expert. Sean Rain, if I can come to you right now, do you think the big concerns on United States is on green exports from China, namely electric vehicles, solar products, and lithium batteries?
Sure, it's great to be here, and excuse what I'm wearing. I'm on vacation in Thailand at the Qingming holidays in China, where 800 million people are traveling. So investors, you want to buy tourist stocks right now because Chinese are back to tourism. But to get back to your question about US-China ties, look, here's the problem. The Chinese automakers like BYD, like NIO, like Li Xiang, they're probably willing to actually open up factories in the United States. But their concern is that if they do so, the xenophobic congressmen like Mike Gallagher, like Tom Cotton are going to say, we're not going to allow them to build a factory in the United States because they're a national security threat. Anything that the Chinese do, whether it be TikTok, whether it be NEVs, whether it be batteries, whether it be garlic, there's congressmen in the United States say it's a national security risk. So the only thing that the Chinese companies can do is not build factories in the US, not create jobs in the US, but they have to export from China into America. That's the problem that we're facing. Because of the xenophobia in the United States right now, Chinese companies can't invest in the US. And we're seeing the same thing in Europe. But what are the Chinese doing? They are building factories. BYD has announced a huge factory in Mexico. So the Chinese companies, they're willing to be equal, fair business people. The problem is coming from the United States and the Biden regime that's trying to contain anything having to do with China.
Right. And Sean, it's not just the United States, even European Union is worried about Chinese exports, and they have put certain duties there to check dumping of Chinese products, as they call it. Let me go across to Brahma Chalani. Brahma Chalani, how much of this concern is due to China's coercive measures around Taiwan? Is this an immediate worry for President Biden that Taiwan should not become another flashpoint?
Certainly, with two wars raging, the US is involved in the Ukraine war, it's also involved in the Israel war. The last thing the US wants is to get involved in the third war. So, forestalling a Taiwan Strait crisis is definitely high on Biden's priority list. But I think beyond the Taiwan issue lies America's proxy war with Russia. That proxy war with Russia is not going well for US interests, but more importantly, it's constricting America's foreign policy options. And therefore, we have seen over the past 1 year or so how Biden has been trying to woo Xi Jinping. Last May, the CIA chief went to Beijing, then a string of US cabinet officials went to Beijing in a beeline. We have Treasury Secretary Yellen now going to Beijing. And then in November, last November, we had Xi Jinping traveling to San Francisco for a in-person summit meeting with Biden. So what we are seeing is an effort on the part of the US to ensure that it does not drive China into a strategic alliance with Russia. But the problem is that the two problems, actually. The first is that by aiding China's rise since the Nixon-Kissinger opening, the US has helped to create the greatest rival it has ever faced in its history. The question is, has the US learned from this? And the second thing is that the US should be seeking to drive a wedge in the China-Russia relationship. Instead, the US may be becoming the bridge that unites China and Russia. And I think the deepening China-Russia relationship can be seen perhaps as the biggest US foreign policy failure of the post-Cold War era.
Right, and many foreign policy experts have warned of that, a closer China-Russia relationship and what it will mean for the United States. Sean, coming back to you, post the meeting, the phone call actually, between President Biden and Xi Jinping, the Chinese president said that the China-US relationship is beginning to stabilize, and this is welcomed by both societies in the international community. But there are also negative factors in the relationship which continue to grow. These are anti-trade measures, as China calls it, that US is imposing. Give us a sense of the negative factors which are playing out in the relationship from China's perspective.
So from China's perspective, it's very clear that the Biden regime and whoever might be the next president, whether it's Biden again or Trump, it doesn't matter, that whatever happens, the United States is going to try to contain China, destabilize the Communist Party. Now, your other guest said that the United States is losing in Israel and is losing in Ukraine its sort of moral standing and is not wanting to go into war against China again right now. I agree with that. But when they're looking at a 10, 20-year period, it's quite clear that American politicians don't want to see a strong China that develops BRICS into something that rivals the G7. But they can't go into a wartime footing with China right now and create a proxy war over Taiwan because the US is overly stretched economically, overly stretched with the debt level, overly stretched militarily around the world. So what Biden and the China is trying to do is sort of stabilize the relationship, but they're still containing. And that's what the Chinese view it, that no matter what Biden is saying with his words, you have to look at his actions. You look at it last week, the major private equity giant, GGV, it's an American one that invested heavily into China, was one of the big backers of Alibaba, had to split the China operations away from the American operations because the Biden regime doesn't want American know-how in the technology sector in investing into China. You see problems like cotton, right? China accounts for 20% of the world's cotton. So the United States have said, well, wait a minute, this is where the cotton is coming from Xinjiang, is where there's allegations of genocide as well as allegations of forced labor. Now, most Chinese believe this is not true, that this is just made up. So the point of this is no matter what the Chinese do, whether it be get strong in NEVs like we talked about, get strong in apps like TikTok, get strong in cotton, the United States is going to continue to put economic pressure using economic coercion to contain China's rise. I agree with the other guests. Biden doesn't want to go into a military conflagration in the next few months, but he is definitely putting the vice and trying to impoverish China. And that's why China's economy is so weak right now. You can see when my firm interviews consumers and businessmen, it's the worst consumer confidence that I've seen in my 27 years in China. It's not because the Communist Party of China or Xi Jinping are not doing right in the economy. It's because everyday Chinese have seen what the Americans have done to impoverish Cubans, impoverish North Koreans, and impoverish Iranians for generations. And now the typical Chinese is worried that the Americans are going to try to impoverish Chinese for the next 30, 40 years. That's the Chinese view on all of the actions that Biden does.
Okay, let me also go back to Brahma Chelani. Brahma Chelani, Janet Yellen is there in China for a total of 5 days. Do you think this kind of a long visit is itself unprecedented? And this, in a way, is majorly to seek a level playing field?
There are economic and financial reasons why Yellen is going to Beijing. But I think the fundamentals should not be forgotten, which is that Biden is seeking to, quote unquote, coexist and cooperate with China. That's his policy. He has resisted labeling China as an enemy, despite Beijing covering up the COVID-19 virus's origins, snuffing out Hong Kong's autonomy, redrawing the geopolitical map of the South China Sea, and changing the territorial status quo in the Himalayas. It has done all that without facing any tangible Western sanctions. The US has also allowed Beijing to escape scot-free over its detention of more than 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang. This is the largest mass incarceration of people on religious grounds since the Nazi era. Imagine if Russia had incarcerated 1 million people, what the Western reaction would have been. The problem is this, that after the paradigm shift in America's China policy during the Trump administration, the Biden administration is seeing a return of China fantasies from the 1970s, from the Nixon era. We're seeing those very old fantasies being revived. For example, that dialogue with Beijing can help to rein in China. No, it's making Xi Jinping more determined to pursue what he calls the Chinese dream, which is basically pursuing expansionism. And it's because of Biden's current quoting of China that the relationship with India is beginning to cool. It's also the reason why the Quad has not met in about a year. And the next Quad meeting will not happen until the US presidential election. That means the earliest it can happen is sometime in spring of next year. So this focus on quoting China that we're seeing in Washington is at the cost of other US foreign policy interests.
Right. We've run out of time, but one more point that Xi Jinping had made in that phone call with President Biden is that Taiwan is the red line in the relationship that must not be crossed. And that is the assurance that President Biden is also giving, that we are not rooting for Taiwan's independence, but China is asking US President Joe Biden to walk the talk on Taiwan. Thank you very much, Sean Rain and Brahmachalani, for joining us on the program, giving us a sense of the hectic discussions between US and China at the highest levels this week. We're taking a break here on Global Eye, but coming up, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopts a resolution calling for Israel to be held accountable for war crimes in Gaza. Israel promises new steps to increase humanitarian aid after a warning from US President Joe Biden. A special discussion when we return.